On Sol 18 of the mission, the Ares 3 crew is busy with their tasks on the landing site. Mark Watney, being the resident botanist, collects a few samples for chemical analysis while the rest go around with their respective tasks. Mark chit-chats over the radio with Martinez, the one in charge of their flight, who's fiddling with the MAV with others listening in and commenting on Mark's small talk. Back at the hab, Johansson, in charge of the crew control center, and Beck, the team doctor, are also busy with work. Johansson suggests to the captain to cut Mark's reception off the radio since he was talking non-stop. Of course, the commander gives the order, and he's cut off almost immediately. There's an emergency mission update, and Johansson informs the crew about a storm approaching them. The captain asks to know how bad the storm was, and Johansson informs her that it would be destructive to the MAV. As everyone returns to the hab to see what was going on, they notice that the storm had escalated, and they needed to take quick action. Vojo, the team physicist, and Mark suggest waiting till the storm comes. However, Commander Lewis gives orders to abort the mission when the storm proved to be damaging their MAV. Martinez leaves to ready the ship for its launch before the MAV tips off due to the strong wind. They all put on their EVA suits and head out with Mark behind them, closing the hab. As the crew struggles through the storm to get to the MAV, their satellite communication dish gets blown off. Those ahead are able to avert it from hitting them, however, Mark gets hit by it and is blown away by the storm. Everyone's in shock, and their efforts to hear from Mark are futile since they lost signals from him. The commander orders the teammates to return to the ship while she searches for Mark, hoping to get a signal from his suit. Martinez informs her that the MAV was tipping off and wouldn't hold any longer in the wind. However, she tells him to launch without her when it does. Beck breaks a harsh reality to her that Mark was eliminated since he wouldn't survive such a storm. Commander Lewis, however, returns to the ship since there was no sign of Mark. She gives Martinez orders to launch before their MAV tips off, shooting out of Mars without Mark. Meanwhile, back on Earth, NASA breaks the news to the public about aborting the Ares 3 mission to Mars when the NASA satellites detected a storm approaching their mission site. He commends Commander Lewis's quick action on evacuating all team members to the ship Hermes before any further damage was done to the MAV. Following that, he breaks the sad news of Mark Watney's demise to the press reporters, causing a ruckus for further questions. Now back on Mars, surprisingly, Watney had survived the hit, and he gasps for air upon regaining consciousness with a critical oxygen level. He manages to pull himself out of the heap of sand, panting in pain as he tries to pull out a thin metal that punctured his EVA suit deep into his stomach. He then returns to the hab to tend to his wound. He endures the pain through the process as he quickly pulls out the rod from his stomach. He cuts off his suit from his body and carefully takes out the remnant of the rod from his stomach, after which he stitches it. He not only grunts in pain from his injury but is frustrated as he's been left stranded on a strange planet. Later on, Mark logs into the hab journal and enters the log for Sol 19A, recording that he's alive. He explains that his blood and the antenna that pierced him had created a bridge on his suit which kept him alive. He records that he didn't die on Sol 18 knowing it would come as a surprise or rather a shock to his crew, NASA, and the world at large. He has no way of communicating with NASA or his crew, and sadly it'll take 4 years for another manned mission to reach him. He's stuck in a hab that is designed to last for only 31 days. He explains that if he miraculously doesn't die of thirst or lack oxygen, he'd eventually run out of food supplies. Mark sits waiting and thinking of ways to survive and also signal to Earth, however, nothing seems to come to mind. It must have been impossible to stomach the fact that he was stranded on a planet where no one except him. He goes about arranging stuff around the hab after which he takes a rest. He promises to stay alive to himself on Sol 21. Mark grunts in pain as he wakes up from sleep. He walks towards a table and places his hand on them thinking of what to do next. He opens up a few cupboards and takes out food supplies. He begins to ration them while eating, after which he uses the bathroom on vac flushing his feces. An idea settles in as he hears the machine freeze dry and seal his waste. He immediately goes back to the kitchen to take out the whole potatoes they'd saved for Thanksgiving. He exclaims in excitement as he goes to enter the log for Sol 21. He records that he's rationed the food supplies to last him for 400 sols. He comes up with an idea to grow the whole potatoes to last him 3 years, and that too on a planet where nothing grows. Later on, he takes out a few sealed feces from the organic waste storage to use as compost for his plant. He moves the solar plates from their original position, making it face the sun directly. He dusts it off, allowing it to trap enough energy from the sun. He stacks some soil samples they'd brought from Earth into a cart, recording every bit of his action. Afterward, he treats his still bleeding injury on Sol 24. Mark takes some sealed faces from the organic waste and stores it in a container. He sets up 2 enclosed tents attached to the mission rover using some tarpaulin. He packs Martian soil outside the hab, pouring it onto the floor of the tent. He takes a break afterward, drinking a grain juice after doing a task that was worth many hands on Sol 31. He makes lines across the already spread Martian soil in the tent as ridges. He cuts open the sealed feces, and he also adds some earth soil, after which he mixes it with some liquid, covering his nose from the stench. He slices the whole potatoes into halves, and shortly afterward he takes the compost alongside the potatoes and buries it. He uses the grain juice as water after covering it up on Sol 36. Mark entertains himself with Commander Lewis's 80s music collection on Sol 36. He ponders on how to get enough water to farm the large square meter he created, with each cubic needing 40 liters of water to farm. Luckily, he's knowledgeable about the recipe, being that he only needs to get oxygen to burn with hydrogen to produce water. Mark fills a cylinder with enough hydrogen from the math. He also uses a radium catalyst to help separate the oxygen from the carbon dioxide in the MAV fuel plant. He narrates the whole process and also how dangerous his plans would prove to be while entering the log for that Sol. He carves out some wood for Martinez's crucifix to help make fire. He goes to bed with the crucifix, hoping and counting on it to work out the next Sol. He rigs up a machine that creates water through small chemical fires, and after a few days, the inside walls of the garden are covered in condensation and the plants begin to sprout. Back on Earth, NASA has a funeral for Mark. Vincent talks to the director about returning to Mars and collecting the equipment Mark's crew abandoned, but the director shoots it down, saying that everything they do would have to be televised and he doesn't want the public seeing Mark's body, that they have to wait. Vincent points out that Mark's body will never decompose on Mars, and that they could frame the mission to look like they were going back to Mars to recover Mark's body for his family. Mindy, a satellite supervisor, receives coordinates directing her attention to Mark's location, and she notices the movement at the base. She quickly places an emergency call to the director to notify him. They realize that this footage is proof that Mark is still alive, and they try to figure out what they're going to tell the public, since they have to release this footage within 24 hours. They're worried that NASA will receive flack for abandoning one of their astronauts. They decide to hold a press conference to let the public know that they will do everything within their power to bring Mark back home alive. On Mars, Mark studies maps at the base and figures out where he needs to be in order to meet the next Mars mission in 4 years. It is about 3,200 kilometers away, and his rover only travels 35 kilometers at a time. Additionally, it will take around 50 days for him to get to the destination from the base. He sets to work making adjustments to the rover so that it will travel farther without having to be brought back to the base to be recharged. He's successful in doubling the battery life, but in order to achieve this, he has to turn the heating in the rover off. Because it's so cold, he won't be able to survive the trip without heat, so he decides to dig up some radioactive material to keep in the back to keep him warm. NASA holds another press conference, letting the public know that by tracking him on their satellites, they have figured out Mark's goal, to meet the next Mars mission when they get there. They've expedited the estimated completion time to 9 months instead of 4 years in hopes of getting to Mark before anything bad happens to him. They decide not to tell Mark's crew that he's still alive because they don't want to distract them while they're still trying to make their way home. Mark harvests 400 potatoes from his garden, planting the smaller ones and setting aside the larger ones to eat later. He is able to locate the Pathfinder, a rover that was lost on Mars several years ago, and he uses it to communicate with NASA using the replica they have back on Earth. The only thing NASA is really able to do with it is move the camera around, but Mark sets up a communication system using hexadecimals so that he can ask more than just yes or no questions. NASA uses the Pathfinder to give Mark instructions on how to hack into the rover to communicate with NASA through the Pathfinder. Vincent tells Mark about their plan to rescue him and Mark is relieved. Mark wants to know how his crew reacted when they found out he was still alive. But Vincent has to admit to him that his crew still doesn't know. Mark is furious that NASA has kept his team in the dark, and Vincent realizes they have to tell the crew. When Mark's crew goes to receive their mail, they get communications from NASA telling them that Mark is still alive and that they plan on trying to save him. Mark does the math, and with all of the food left over on the base in addition to all of the potatoes he has grown, he has just enough food to last until NASA is able to send another ship to come get him, as long as nothing goes wrong. While Mark is tending to his garden, the entrance chamber explodes, injuring him and leaving his helmet cracked. He quickly seals it with duct tape to replenish his oxygen. He goes back to his garden to find that the exposure of Mars' atmosphere killed all of his plants and destroyed the system he had set up for keeping them watered. Mark tells NASA about the accident, and they realize that if they don't speed up the timeline for getting to Mark, he won't have enough food to last him until they get there. Mark's old crew is granted permission from NASA to contact him, and they catch up, heckling each other. Mark cleans up the area of the base he had reserved for growing his potatoes, taking out all the tarp and dirt and resealing the hole where the hatch had been. NASA decides to skip inspections on the ship they plan to use to rescue Mark, reasoning that there probably isn't anything wrong with it, and the inspection would take up an unnecessary amount of time. On launch, the ship explodes, all of their hard work going up in flames. China's Space Division watches the newscast about NASA's failed launch and offer their aid. With the help of Rich, a physicist, NASA is able to come up with a better plan to rescue Mark in less time. The Hermes, the ship that Mark's crew is on, will swing back into Earth's orbit long enough to be sent a fresh supply of food, then shoot back into space to pick up Mark without landing. The only problem with the plan is that it will add 500 days to the Hermes travel time. NASA's director vetoes the plan, explaining that he doesn't want to risk the lives of everyone on board the Hermes to save Mark. Another NASA coordinator thinks this is unfair and sends the plan details to the Hermes in secret. Mark's crew discusses the plan amongst themselves, realizing that if they follow through with it, they will be committing mutiny. They discuss whether or not they want to spend another 500 days in space away from their families, but ultimately decide it's the right thing to do. They take a unanimous vote to go back for Mark. Each of the crew members contacts their families to let them know they will be gone longer than they had originally planned. NASA is notified that the Hermes has gone off its plotted course, and the director scolds the other coordinator for secretly sending out the plans to the crew. In order for the plan to work, Mark has to figure out how to gather up all the equipment keeping him alive, the machines providing him with heat and oxygen, and get them to the ship in time to meet up with the Hermes as they pass Mars. The Hermes swings by Earth and picks up supplies and uses the gravitational pull of Earth's atmosphere as momentum to launch them back towards Mars without using as much fuel. After 7 months, Mark begins preparing to meet the Hermes. He gathers all of his supplies and packs them into the rover. He takes the solar panels with him so he can recharge the rover occasionally without having to come back to the base. NASA reasons that Mark's ship will have to be going really fast to meet up with the Hermes, so they instruct Mark to remove all of the equipment that is now unnecessary. He takes out all of the supplies meant for a 6-person crew and leaves only enough for the 1-person trip. He is also instructed to take off the front and sides of the ship and replace them with tarp to reduce the weight, and to remove all of the control panels since the Hermes will be operating his ship remotely. Mark leaves the rover for the last time and enters the ship to get ready. He shaves off the beard he's grown, puts on new clothes and a space suit, and awaits instruction from his crew. They reassure him and warn him that he might pass out because of the force of the launch. Mark's ship takes off and the tarps get sucked into space almost immediately. Mark passes out and is unable to communicate with his crew to let them know that he is okay. Mark wakes up, and his crew informs him that they won't be able to get their ship close enough to Mark's. The commander instructs one of the crew members to construct an explosive and rig it to the back of the ship to slow them down so they have a better chance of reaching Mark. They set off the bomb and are in sight of Mark's ship, but not close enough to reach him. The commander puts on a space suit, straps herself into a chair on the outside of the ship, tethers it with a length of rope, and makes her way towards Mark. Unfortunately, the cable isn't long enough, so Mark cuts a hole in his suit and uses the air pressure to guide him to the commander. She catches him, reels him in, and they go back inside to reunite with the rest of the crew. They let NASA know they have Mark and are on their way home. Back on Earth several years later, Mark is teaching NASA initiates about safety and preparedness in space. The Ares 4 launches, and the crew members of the Hermes watch the launch on the television with their loved ones. The end.